Most people believe they understand danger. They see it in movies. They read about it in books. They hear stories from friends who once got lost on a hiking trail for 20 minutes. But real danger, the kind that makes your body forget how to move, the kind that turns your blood cold and makes your mind go completely blank, that kind of danger is something most people will never truly understand. This is a story about a woman who thought she was prepared for everything. She had the best gear. She had the maps. She had the training. But the wilderness does not care about preparation. The wilderness does not respect confidence. And on one terrible afternoon in the deep forests of Northern California, she learned a lesson that would change her life forever. She screamed words that echoed through the ancient trees. She begged for mercy from something that had no mercy to give. And just when she believed it was all over, a stranger appeared from the shadows of the forest, a man who lived by old ways, a Cahto hunter who carried knowledge that no modern textbook could ever teach. What he told her to do sounded insane. What happened next was something she would never forget. The morning had started with sunshine and birdsong. Clara Bennett had packed her bag the night before, checking every item twice. She was a careful woman by nature. She planned things. She made lists. She organized her life in neat little boxes, and she liked it that way. At 34 years old, she had already built a successful career as an environmental researcher in San Francisco. Her apartment was clean. Her schedule was tight. Her routines were solid. But there was one thing that Clara craved more than order, and that was the wild. Every few months, she would leave the city behind and drive north. She would pass through small towns with gas stations and diners and old men sitting on porches. She would watch the buildings grow smaller and the trees grow taller. She would feel the air change, becoming thicker, cooler, filled with the smell of pine and wet earth. And when she finally reached the edge of the wilderness, she would park her truck, strap on her pack, and walk into the trees like she was going home. This trip was different, though. Clara had been assigned a new research project by her university. She was studying the old-growth forests of Mendocino County, specifically the areas near the Round Valley. These were remote places, deep places, the kind of places where the trails disappeared after a few miles and the forest swallowed everything. Her professor had warned her to be careful. Her colleagues had suggested she take a partner. But Clara had shaken her head. She worked better alone. She always had. She had driven up from the city on a Thursday evening, stopping in Willits to grab supplies. The woman at the general store had looked at her map and raised an eyebrow. "You going out past Cavallo?" she had asked. Clara had nodded. The woman had paused and said, "Just watch yourself out there. That land has a memory." Clara had smiled politely and thanked her, not really understanding what the woman meant. She would understand later. Friday morning came bright and clear. Clara parked her truck at the end of a dirt road that barely qualified as a road at all. It was more like a suggestion carved into the earth by old logging trucks decades ago. She checked her GPS. She checked her compass. She checked her water, her food, her first aid kit, her satellite phone. Everything was in order. She locked the truck and started walking. The first few hours were beautiful. The forest was old, ancient even. The trees were enormous, some of them wider than her truck. Redwoods and Douglas firs reached up so high that their tops disappeared into a green haze. The ground was soft with layers of fallen needles and decaying leaves. Ferns grew in thick clusters, some of them reaching up to her waist. Sunlight came through the canopy in golden beams, lighting up patches of moss and wild mushrooms. Clara stopped often to take samples. She collected soil. She measured tree diameters. She photographed fungi and recorded bird calls on her phone. She was in her element. This was why she had chosen this career. Not for the office work, not for the papers and presentations, but for this, for the quiet, for the ancient silence of a forest that had existed long before humans had arrived and would exist long after they were gone. By noon, she had gone deeper than she had planned. The trail she had been following had faded about an hour earlier, and she was now navigating by compass and GPS alone. The terrain had changed too. The gentle slopes had given way to steeper ridges. The ground was rockier. The creeks she crossed were running fast with cold mountain water. She stopped by one of these creeks to eat lunch, sitting on a flat rock and chewing a granola bar while she studied her map. She noticed something she had not seen before. About 3 miles ahead, according to the map, there was a small valley. It was not marked with any trail or campsite. It was just a blank green space on the map, surrounded by contour lines that suggested steep walls on all sides. But her research data indicated that this valley might contain some of the oldest trees in the region, trees that had never been logged, never been studied. If she could reach it before dark, she could set up camp and spend the next day taking samples. Clara made her decision. She packed up her lunch and kept walking. The afternoon brought clouds. They rolled in slowly from the west, thick and grey, blocking the sun and dropping the temperature by several degrees. Clara pulled on her jacket and kept moving. The forest was darker now, the shadows deeper. The bird song had quieted. She could hear the wind moving through the upper branches, a sound like distant breathing. By 3 o'clock, she reached the edge of the valley, and it was everything she had hoped for. The trees here were massive, bigger than anything she had seen so far. Some of them had trunks so wide that 5 people holding hands could not have circled them. The ground was covered in thick moss that cushioned every step. A small stream wound through the center of the valley, clear and cold. It was like stepping into another world, a world untouched by time. Clara set up her tent near the stream, using the last of the daylight to secure her camp. She hung her food bag from a high branch, a precaution against bears. She built a small fire ring with stones from the creek. She filtered water and filled her bottles. By the time she crawled into her tent, the clouds had thickened and a light rain had begun to fall. She lay in her sleeping bag, listening to the rain on the tent fabric. It was peaceful. She felt safe. She felt like the forest had accepted her, had opened its doors and let her in. She fell asleep quickly, dreaming of old trees and quiet streams. She woke up at dawn. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still overcast. The air was damp and cold. Clara climbed out of her tent, stretched, and started her morning routine. Coffee from her camp stove, a handful of trail mix, a quick check of her gear. Everything was fine. Everything was normal. She spent the morning working. She measured trees. She took core samples with her increment borer, carefully extracting thin cylinders of wood that would reveal the age of each tree. Some of these cores showed hundreds of rings. Some showed over 1,000. Clara was thrilled. This was exactly the kind of data her research needed. Around midday, she decided to explore the far end of the valley. The map showed that the terrain rose sharply beyond the valley floor, climbing up to a ridge that overlooked the surrounding forest. If she could reach the ridge, she might get a better view of the area and plan her route for the next day. She packed a small day bag with water, her camera, and her first aid kit. She left her tent and most of her gear at the campsite and started walking toward the ridge. The forest grew thicker as she moved away from the stream. The undergrowth was dense, with thorny bushes and tangled vines that caught at her legs. She pushed through, using her hands to clear a path. The climb to the ridge was steep. The soil was wet from the rain, and she slipped several times, grabbing at roots and rocks to pull herself up. Her boots were caked with mud. Her hands were scratched from the thorns. But she kept going, driven by the desire to see what was at the top. She never made it to the top. It happened about halfway up the ridge. Clara was pulling herself over a large fallen log when her foot slipped on the wet bark. She lost her balance and fell forward, landing hard on the other side of the log. The impact knocked the breath out of her. She lay there for a moment, gasping, staring up at the grey sky through the trees. Then she felt the pain. It started in her right leg, just below the knee. At first it was a dull ache, like a bruise. But within seconds, it sharpened into something much worse, a hot, stabbing pain that made her cry out. She sat up and looked down at her leg. A broken branch, sharp as a spear, was sticking out of the ground at an angle. When she had fallen, her leg had come down directly on it. The branch had gone through her pant leg and into the flesh of her calf. It was not deep, maybe an inch or two, but it was enough to cause serious bleeding. The fabric around the wound was already turning dark red. Clara's training kicked in. She had taken wilderness first aid courses. She knew what to do. She carefully pulled her leg free from the branch, gritting her teeth against the pain. She opened her day bag and pulled out her first aid kit. She cleaned the wound with antiseptic wipes. She applied pressure with a gauze pad. She wrapped it tightly with a bandage. The bleeding slowed, but it did not stop. The wound was deeper than she had thought. She could see the muscle beneath the torn skin, red and raw. She needed stitches. She needed real medical help. And she was miles from her truck, miles from any road, miles from anyone. Clara reached for her satellite phone. She pressed the power button. Nothing happened. She pressed it again. Still nothing. The screen was cracked. When she had fallen, the phone had been in her bag. and the impact had broken it against the rocks. She stared at the dead screen, and for the first time, she felt real fear. She was alone. She was injured. She had no way to call for help, and she was deep in a wilderness that very few people ever visited. Clara took a deep breath. She told herself to stay calm. She told herself that panic was the enemy. She could still walk. The wound was painful, but it was not life-threatening. As long as she could keep it clean and stop the bleeding. She just needed to get back to her campsite, pack up her gear, and start the long walk back to her truck. She stood up slowly, testing her weight on the injured leg. It held, but every step sent a bolt of pain shooting up her thigh. She found a sturdy stick to use as a walking aid and began making her way back down the ridge. The descent was harder than the climb. The wet ground made every step treacherous. She slipped and caught herself again and again, each time jarring the wound in her leg. The bandage was soaking through with blood. She stopped twice to rewrap it, using more gauze from her kit. By the time she reached the valley floor, the afternoon was fading. The clouds had darkened, and the wind was picking up. Another storm was coming. She could smell the rain in the air, that thick, electric scent that always came before a downpour. Clara limped toward her campsite, following the sound of the stream. Every step was an effort now. The pain in her leg had become a constant throb, and she could feel her energy draining away. She was sweating despite the cold. Her vision was slightly blurry. She recognized these as signs of blood loss and shock, and the recognition frightened her more than anything else. She was about 100 yards from her tent when she heard it. A sound, low and deep. A rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Clara stopped. She stood perfectly still, her heart hammering in her chest. She scanned the trees around her, looking for the source of the sound. The forest was still. The birds had gone silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then she saw it. About 50 feet ahead, standing in the shadows between two massive redwoods, was a mountain lion. It was big, much bigger than she had expected. Its body was muscular and sleek, covered in tawny fur that blended almost perfectly with the browns and golds of the forest floor. Its eyes were fixed on her, golden and unblinking. Its tail swished slowly back and forth. Clara had read about mountain lion encounters. She knew the rules. Make yourself look big. Make noise. Do not run. Never turn your back. She raised her arms above her head. She shouted. She banged her walking stick against a tree. The mountain lion did not move. It just stood there, watching her. Its ears were flat against its head. Its body was low, the muscles in its shoulders and haunches coiled tight. Clara recognized the posture. It was hunting posture. This was not a curious animal that had stumbled upon a human. This was a predator that had identified prey. And prey was exactly what Clara was. She was injured. She was bleeding. She was slow. She was alone. Every instinct the mountain lion had was telling it that this was an easy kill. Clara backed up slowly, keeping her eyes on the animal. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her hands were shaking. She wanted to run. Every cell in her body was screaming at her to run, but she knew that running would trigger the chase response. If she ran, it would be on her in seconds. She kept backing up. 10 feet. 20 feet. The mountain lion matched her movement, stepping forward with fluid, silent steps. It was closing the distance. Slowly, patiently, like a cat playing with a mouse. Then Clara's heel caught on a root, and she stumbled. She did not fall, but the stumble broke her rhythm. She dropped her walking stick. She bent down to pick it up, and in that split second when her eyes left the mountain lion, it moved. It did not charge. Not yet. But it dropped even lower, its belly almost touching the ground. A deep, resonant growl rolled out of its throat, vibrating the air between them. Clara froze. She was looking directly into the eyes of a predator that had decided she was food. And then, from somewhere behind her, she heard a voice. Do not move. The voice was calm, steady, quiet, but absolutely firm. It came from the trees to her left, from the shadows that she had not been watching. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to turn, wanted to see who was speaking, but the voice had told her not to move, and something in its tone told her to obey. Keep your eyes on the cat, the voice continued. Do not look at me. Do not look away from it. Clara obeyed. She stared at the mountain lion, which had paused. Its ears twitched. It had heard the voice too. Its golden eyes shifted slightly, looking past Clara into the trees behind her. Footsteps, soft, barely audible, coming closer. Clara could feel the presence of another person moving up beside her, staying just outside her peripheral vision. Then, slowly, a figure stepped into view on her left side. He was a man, maybe 50 or 60 years old, though his face had the kind of weathered quality that made exact age impossible to guess. He was not tall, but he was solidly built with broad shoulders and thick forearms. His skin was dark brown, creased and lined by decades of sun and wind. His hair was black with streaks of grey pulled back from his face and tied with a simple leather cord. He wore a faded canvas jacket, heavy boots, and carried a long wooden bow in one hand. He did not look at Clara. His eyes were fixed on the mountain lion with the same steady, unblinking intensity that the animal was directing at them. "My name is Thomas Bauer," he said, his voice still low and calm. "I am going to help you, but you have to do exactly what I say." Clara nodded. She could barely breathe. The mountain lion growled again, its tail snapping back and forth with more urgency now. It seemed uncertain. The presence of a second human had changed the equation, but it had not abandoned its intent. Its eyes moved between Clara and the man. Calculating, Thomas slowly raised his left hand. In it, Clara saw a thick piece of leather, old and dark with age, about the size of a wallet. He held it out toward her, without looking away from the animal. "Take this," he said. "When I tell you, put it between your teeth and bite down. Bite hard." Clara stared at the piece of leather. Her mind was spinning. Nothing about this made sense. She was bleeding. A mountain lion was ready to attack, and this stranger was handing her a piece of leather and telling her to bite it. "Why?" she whispered. "Because what happens next is going to hurt," Thomas said, "and you cannot scream. If you scream, it charges. Do you understand?" Clara took the leather with trembling hands. She understood nothing, but she also understood, on some deep primal level, that this man knew exactly what he was doing. He had appeared from the forest like a ghost. He was standing in front of a mountain lion without an ounce of fear in his body. He was Cahto. He was a hunter, and he had survived in these woods his entire life. She put the leather between her teeth. Thomas nodded, still watching the mountain lion. "Good," he said. "Now listen to me carefully. When I move, you stay still. No matter what happens, you stay still, and you bite down. It will end fast." The mountain lion shifted its weight onto its back legs. Clara could see the muscles bunching, coiling, preparing. Thomas whispered one last thing. "Now." Thomas moved like water. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion, no sound. One moment he was standing beside Clara, still as a tree. The next he had taken 3 long strides forward and to the right, placing himself directly between Clara and the mountain lion. In his right hand, the bow came up in a single fluid arc, but he did not draw an arrow. Instead, he swung the bow wide and slammed the lower limb against the trunk of the nearest redwood. The sound that erupted was enormous. It was a deep, booming crack that echoed through the valley like a thunderclap. The mountain lion flinched. Its whole body jerked backward, ears pinning flat, lips pulling away from teeth that were long and white and curved like knives. Thomas struck the tree again, harder this time, and let out a shout that came from somewhere deep in his chest. It was not a scream or a yell. It was something older, something raw and primal, a sound that belonged to the forest as much as the growl of the cat. At the same moment, something happened behind Clara. She did not see it because Thomas had told her not to move, but she heard it. A sharp snap, like a branch breaking, then a yelp high and brief, from somewhere in the bushes to her right. The mountain lion's eyes darted toward the sound. Its body language changed in an instant. The coiled tension in its muscles released. The predatory focus in its eyes broke. It looked confused, uncertain, pulled between 2 threats it could not understand. Thomas took another step forward and shouted again. This time he raised the bow above his head with both hands, making himself as large as possible. His voice filled the valley, bouncing off the ancient trees and rolling up the ridge. The mountain lion hissed, a sound like steam escaping a pipe, and then it turned. It did not run. Mountain lions do not run from anything. But it retreated, backing into the shadows with its eyes still fixed on Thomas, its tail low, its body pressed to the ground. In 10 seconds, it was gone, swallowed by the forest as if it had never existed. Clara's legs gave out. She dropped to the ground, her whole body shaking. The leather strip fell from her teeth. She was gasping, pulling in air in ragged gulps that sounded like sobs. Her hands were clawing at the dirt. Her vision was swimming with black spots. She could feel her heart slamming against her ribs like something trying to break free. Thomas was beside her in 3 steps. He knelt down, not touching her, just close enough that she could see his face. His expression had not changed. There was no panic in his eyes, no rush, no urgency. He looked the way he had looked from the first moment she saw him. Calm, present, certain. "Breathe," he said. "Slow, in through your nose, out through your mouth. You are safe now." Clara tried. The first breath came in a stutter, hitching in her throat. The second was slightly better. By the third, the black spots were starting to clear. She looked up at Thomas and realized she was crying. Tears were running down her cheeks, mixing with the dirt and sweat on her face. She wiped them away with the back of her hand and tried to speak. What just happened?" Thomas sat back on his heels and looked toward the trees where the mountain lion had disappeared. "She was hunting you," he said simply. "Young female, maybe 3 years old. She has been following you since you came down the ridge." Clara felt her stomach drop. "Following me? For how long? Since you started bleeding?" Thomas looked at her leg. The bandage was soaked through again, the fabric dark and wet. Mountain lions can smell blood from a long distance. You were injured and alone. To her, you were easy food. The matter-of-fact way he said it made Clara's skin crawl. She looked down at her wounded leg and felt a wave of nausea. She had been prey. She had been hunted. Every step she had taken down that ridge, the mountain lion had been watching, calculating, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Why did it leave?" she asked. Thomas reached into the brush beside him and pulled out a small device, a simple wooden clapper, 2 flat pieces of hardwood connected by a leather hinge. Noise and confusion. Cats are ambush hunters. They want a clean attack on a single target. When I made noise from the front and my snare broke from the side, she lost her advantage. She did not know how many threats there were or where they were coming from. That is enough to make most cats retreat. "Your snare?" Thomas nodded. He reached behind a fallen log and held up a thin cord made of braided plant fiber. At one end, a small branch had been tied in a loop that was now broken. "I set trip lines when I am in the field, small ones around my camp, around places where I am working. They catch rabbits sometimes, but they also make noise when anything touches them. That snap you heard was the cat's tail brushing one of my lines as she circled behind you." Clara stared at him. She had 100 questions, but her mind was struggling to organize them. Who was this man? Why was he here? How had he appeared at exactly the right moment? Thomas seemed to read her thoughts. He stood up and offered her his hand. "We need to move. Your wound needs proper care, and we should not stay where the cat was hunting." "She may come back. Can you walk?" His grip was firm and dry, his palm calloused from years of outdoor work. She pulled herself up, wincing as the pain in her calf flared. Thomas watched her face carefully, reading the pain. "It is worse than you are telling yourself," he said. "I can see it in the way you hold your weight. But we only need to go about half a mile. My camp is on the other side of the stream, near the big rocks. Can you make it that far?" Clara nodded, though she was not entirely sure. The bleeding had slowed, but the wound felt hot and swollen, and every step sent a sharp ache up through her knee. Thomas picked up her walking stick and handed it to her. Then he moved to her left side, not supporting her exactly, but positioning himself close enough that he could catch her if she fell. They walked slowly. Thomas set the pace, and it was much slower than Clara would have expected from a man who moved through the forest with such ease. He was being patient with her, adjusting his speed to match her limp, pausing whenever she needed to rest. He did not talk much during the walk, but he was constantly watching. His eyes moved across the trees, the ground, the sky. He was reading the forest the way Clara read data on a screen, absorbing information from 1,000 small signals that she could not even see. After about 20 minutes, they reached his camp. It was not what Clara had expected. There was no tent, no sleeping bag, no modern gear of any kind. Instead, there was a small lean-to built against the base of a massive redwood, constructed from branches, bark, and fern fronds. A fire pit sat in front of it, ringed with smooth river stones. A thin line of smoke rose from the coals, the remains of a morning fire. Several items hung from the branches of nearby trees: strips of dried meat, bundles of herbs, a water container made from what looked like animal hide. Thomas guided Clara to a flat stone near the fire pit and helped her sit down. Then he knelt beside her and unwrapped the bandage on her leg. The wound looked bad. The edges of the torn skin had turned white, and the flesh beneath was an angry red. The bleeding had mostly stopped, but the area around the wound was swollen and warm to the touch. Clara could see tiny flecks of dirt and bark embedded in the muscle. "This needs to be cleaned properly," Thomas said. "The branch that cut you was old wood, decaying. There is bacteria in it that will cause infection if we do not get it out." He stood up and moved to his lean-to, returning with a collection of items that he laid out on a flat rock beside Clara: a small stone bowl, a leather pouch, a thin bone needle with plant fiber thread, a strip of clean animal hide, and a clay jar sealed with wax. "What are those?" Clara asked, eyeing the items nervously. "Medicine," Thomas said. He opened the leather pouch and poured a handful of dried leaves into the stone bowl. Clara recognized some of them: yarrow, which she knew had been used by indigenous peoples for centuries as an antiseptic and to stop bleeding. The others she did not recognize. Thomas added a small amount of water from his hide container and began grinding the leaves into a paste with a smooth riverstone. "I need to clean the wound first," he said, looking at her directly. "It is going to hurt. A lot. I will flush it with water, and then I will pick out the debris with the needle. You understand?" Clara nodded. She remembered the leather strip he had given her earlier and realized why he had said what he said. "Bite this. It will end fast." He had been preparing her for this moment. Not just the mountain lion encounter, but the treatment of her wound. He had known from the moment he saw her leg that this was coming. "The leather," she said. Thomas reached into his jacket and produced the same strip he had offered before. He held it out to her. "It helps," he said. "My grandmother taught me that. When there is pain that you cannot avoid, you give the body something to do. The jaw is strong. When you bite down, it gives your brain something to focus on, something besides the pain." Clara took the leather and placed it between her teeth. It tasted of smoke and animal fat and old earth. She bit down and nodded. Thomas poured water over the wound. The first splash was cold and made Clara flinch, but it was bearable. Then he picked up the bone needle and leaned in close. His hands were steady, completely steady, as he began to probe the edges of the wound, picking out tiny fragments of bark and dirt. Clara screamed. She screamed through the leather, her jaw clamping down so hard she thought her teeth might crack. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was not sharp like the original injury. It was deep and burning, as if someone were pressing a hot coal into the raw muscle of her leg. Her hands gripped the stone beneath her, her knuckles turning white. Tears poured down her face. Thomas worked quickly, but he did not rush. Every movement was precise and careful. He murmured as he worked, soft words in a language Clara did not understand. It was not English. It was something older, something that rose and fell like the sound of the stream beside them. She did not know what the words meant, but the rhythm of them helped. It gave her something to listen to, something to anchor her mind while her body screamed. After what felt like an hour but was probably closer to 10 minutes, Thomas set the needle down. "The worst is done," he said. He applied the paste he had made from the leaves, spreading it gently over the wound with his fingers. The paste was warm and tingled against the raw skin. Within seconds, the burning pain began to fade, replaced by a cool, numbing sensation that spread through her calf. Clara spat out the leather strip and gasped. "What is that?" she asked, looking at the green paste on her leg. "Yarrow, wild tobacco, and a plant my people call bitterroot," Thomas said. "The yarrow stops the bleeding and fights infection. The tobacco numbs the pain. The bitter root draws out poison from the wood." He picked up the bone needle again, this time threaded with the plant fiber. "I need to close the wound," he said. "It will hurt, but much less than what you just went through." Clara bit down on the leather again. Thomas stitched the wound closed with quick, practiced movements. The fiber tugged at her skin, but the numbing paste had dulled the sensation enough that it was bearable. When he was done, he covered the wound with a piece of clean hide, tying it in place with thin strips of leather. "It is not perfect," he said, sitting back and examining his work. "You will need real medical attention when you get back. Antibiotics probably. And a doctor should check my stitches. But this will hold for now. It will keep the dirt out and the blood in." Clara looked down at the bandage. It was primitive by any modern standard, but it was also remarkably neat and secure. She flexed her foot experimentally. The pain was still there, but it had retreated to a manageable throb, distant and dull. "Thank you," she said. The words felt completely inadequate, but they were all she had. Thomas nodded. He began cleaning his tools, washing the needle and the stone bowl in the stream. Clara watched him, studying the way he moved. Everything he did was deliberate and unhurried. There was no wasted energy, no unnecessary motion. He was like the forest itself, quiet and efficient, and perfectly adapted to its environment. "How did you find me?" she asked. Thomas did not look up from his work. "I have been in this valley for 4 days," he said. "I am tracking a herd of elk that moves through here every autumn. I saw your camp this morning, the tent, the fire ring, the food bag in the tree. I knew someone was here. Why did you not come and introduce yourself?" "Because you did not need me then." He looked up at her. "I am not a social person. I come to the forest to work, to hunt, to be with the land. I do not seek out strangers. But when I saw you come down the ridge this afternoon, and I saw the blood on your leg, and I saw the cat following you, then you needed me." Clara felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the cold air. "You saw the mountain lion before I did?" "I've been watching her for 2 days," Thomas said. "She has a territory on the North Ridge. She is young and still learning to hunt. Normally she takes deer, but a wounded human moving slowly through her territory was too tempting for her to pass up." "You watched her follow me?" Thomas shook his head. "I did not see her follow you. I saw her tracks near your camp this morning, and I saw fresh tracks on the ridge when I went up after you." I put the pieces together. "I have been tracking animals in this forest since I was 8 years old. After a while, you do not just follow tracks, you think like the animal. You know where it will go before it goes there." The idea that this man had read the forest like a story, piecing together the movements of a predator from footprints and broken twigs and subtle signs she would never have noticed, was both humbling and astonishing.
"You said you are Cahto," she said.
"My mother was Cahto," Thomas corrected. "My father was German, a logger who came to Mendocino County in the 1960s. My name is Thomas Bauer. Not a traditional Cahto name." He smiled slightly, the first time Clara had seen anything approaching humor on his face. "But my mother raised me in the old ways. She taught me the language, the songs, the medicines. She taught me how to read the forest, how to listen to it, how to live inside it without taking more than I need. And the hunting? My uncle taught me to hunt. He was the last of the old hunters in our community, one of the few who still used the bow and the snare and the knowledge that our people had carried for thousands of years. He taught me to track deer, to read the wind, to understand the patterns of the animals. He said that a hunter is not someone who kills. A hunter is someone who understands." Thomas paused and looked out at the forest. The light was fading now, the grey sky darkening toward evening. The first drops of rain had begun to fall, tapping against the leaves above them. "My people have lived on this land for a very long time," he continued. "Before the Spanish came, before the Americans, before the loggers cut down the great forests and built their towns and their roads, we were here. We knew every tree, every stream, every animal. We knew the medicines that grew in the shadows and the foods that grew in the sun. We knew the songs that the wind carried and the stories that the mountains told." His voice had changed. It was quieter now, and there was something in it that Clara could not quite name. Not sadness exactly, but a kind of weight, as if the words themselves carried the gravity of centuries. "Most of that knowledge is gone now," Thomas said. "Lost. Destroyed. When the settlers came, they did not just take our land. They took our language, our ceremonies, our way of living. They put our children in schools and told them to forget who they were. They banned our songs and burned our medicines and killed the animals we depended on." Clara said nothing. She knew some of this history, the broad strokes of colonization and displacement that were taught in schools and universities. But hearing it from Thomas, sitting in the middle of the same forest where his people had lived for millennia, it felt different. It felt personal. It felt real. "My mother was one of the last fluent speakers of our language," Thomas said. "When she died, there were maybe 5 or 6 people left who could speak it. Now there are fewer, maybe 2 or 3. When they die, the language dies with them." He turned back to Clara. "That is why I come here. Not just to hunt. I come to remember. I come to practice the old ways, to keep them alive, even if only in myself. Every time I set a snare or mix a medicine or read the tracks of an animal, I am carrying on something that my ancestors gave me, something that is older than the trees in this valley. The rain was falling harder now, drumming on the bark roof of the lean-to. Thomas stood up and added wood to the fire pit, blowing gently on the coals until they caught. The fire grew, casting warm orange light across the camp. He hung a small pot over the flames and poured water into it, adding dried meat and a handful of roots and herbs. "You need to eat," he said, "and rest. Tomorrow I will take you back to your vehicle. It is a long walk and your leg will slow us down. We should start at first light." Clara nodded. She realized how exhausted she was. The adrenaline from the mountain lion encounter had worn off, and in its place was a bone-deep tiredness that made her limbs feel heavy and her eyelids droop. The warmth of the fire, the smell of the cooking food, and the steady rhythm of the rain were pulling her towards sleep. But there was something she needed to ask first. Something that had been nagging at her since Thomas had first appeared. "Earlier," she said, "when the mountain lion was about to charge, you told me to bite the leather. You said it would end fast. What did you mean? What were you going to do if the cat had attacked?" Thomas stirred the pot and did not answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "I was going to put myself between you and the cat." Clara stared at him. "That could have killed you." "Yes. Why would you do that? You do not even know me." Thomas looked at her across the fire. The flames reflected in his dark eyes, and for a moment, Clara saw something there that she could not explain. It was not bravery, though he was clearly brave. It was not selflessness, though his willingness to risk his life for a stranger was remarkable. It was something deeper, something rooted in the same earth beneath their feet. "Because my uncle taught me that a hunter protects," Thomas said. "Not just himself, not just his family. A hunter protects the balance. And the balance said that you were not supposed to die in this valley today." Clara did not know what to say, so she said nothing. She sat by the fire and ate the food Thomas gave her, a rich, hearty stew that tasted of smoke and wild herbs. She listened to the rain and the crackle of the flames and the quiet breathing of the forest around them. And slowly, despite everything that had happened, despite the pain in her leg and the fear that still lingered in her chest, she felt something she had not expected. She felt safe. Thomas offered her the lean-to for the night. He said he would sleep by the fire, as he often did. Clara protested, but he insisted with a quiet firmness that she was learning not to argue with. She crawled into the shelter and lay down on a bed of dried ferns and soft bark. It was surprisingly comfortable. The bark roof kept the rain out, and the ferns were warm and fragrant. She lay there listening to the sounds of the night, the rain on the leaves, the hiss of the fire, the distant call of an owl. And beneath it all, the steady, ancient heartbeat of the forest. A pulse that had been beating since long before humans walked this earth and would continue long after they were gone. Clara closed her eyes and thought about Thomas and his people and the knowledge they carried. She thought about the mountain lion and the way its eyes had looked in the fading light, golden and wild and completely free of doubt. She thought about the wound in her leg and the paste made from plants that grew in the shadow of trees that were older than any building in any city she had ever known. And she thought about what Thomas had said. A hunter protects the balance. She did not fully understand what he meant. Not yet. But she had the feeling that by the time this journey was over, she would. The rain fell harder. The fire crackled and popped. Thomas sat beneath the trees, still and watchful, his eyes on the darkness between the trunks where the mountain lion had disappeared. And somewhere in that darkness, two golden eyes watched back. Clara woke before dawn. For a brief, disorienting moment, she did not know where she was. The smell of bark and fern and damp earth filled her nose. The sound of rain had stopped, replaced by the dripping of water from leaves and the soft chorus of birds beginning their morning songs. Then the pain in her leg reminded her, a sharp pulse that brought everything rushing back. The fall, the blood, the mountain lion. Thomas. She pushed herself up slowly, wincing as her calf protested. The lean-to was dim, lit only by the grey light of early morning filtering through gaps in the bark roof. She could see her breath in the cold air. Her body ached in places she had not known could ache. Her shoulders from catching herself during the fall, her hands from gripping rocks and roots, her jaw from biting down on the leather strip. But beneath all the pain, she was alive. That simple fact carried a weight that she had never fully appreciated before. She crawled out of the lean-to and found Thomas already awake. He was crouching by the fire pit, feeding small sticks to a fresh flame. A thin column of smoke rose straight up into the still morning air. The forest around them was wrapped in a low mist that hung between the trees like curtains of pale silk. Everything was wet and glistening. Droplets of water clung to every surface, catching the faint light and turning the forest into a world of tiny, scattered diamonds. Thomas looked up as she emerged. His face was unreadable as always, but there was a slight nod, a small acknowledgement that she had made it through the night. "How is the leg?" he asked. Clara tested her weight on it carefully. The pain was still there, but it was different from yesterday. Less sharp, more of a deep, steady ache. The hide bandage Thomas had applied was still secure, and there was no sign of fresh bleeding. She took a few experimental steps and found that she could walk. Slowly and with a limp, but she could walk better, she said. "The paste you put on it, whatever it was, it helped." Thomas nodded. "The herbs will keep working for several more hours, but you need real medicine soon." Antibiotics. A proper doctor. "The forest medicines are strong, but they are not enough for a wound like that." He handed her a cup made from hollowed bark filled with warm liquid. Clara took a sip and tasted something earthy and slightly sweet, a tea made from roots or bark that she could not identify. It was surprisingly good, and the warmth spread through her chest and into her limbs, pushing back the morning cold. "We should eat and then go," Thomas said. "The walk to your truck will take most of the day with your leg. We need to move while the weather holds." Clara looked up at the sky. The clouds from yesterday had thinned, and patches of pale blue were showing through. It was not sunny, but it was dry, and after the storms of the past 2 days, dry felt like a gift. They ate a simple breakfast of dried elk meat and a handful of nuts that Thomas produced from a pouch in his pack. He ate quickly and efficiently, as he did everything, and then began breaking down his camp. Clara watched as he dismantled the lean-to, scattering the branches and bark so that they blended back into the forest floor. He buried the fire pit and covered it with leaves and moss. He removed his trip lines and snares, coiling the cords and tucking them into his pack. Within 20 minutes, the camp had vanished. Clara looked at the spot where the lean-to had stood and could see no trace of it. If she had not spent the night there herself, she would never have known that anyone had been there at all. "You do that every time?" she asked. "Every time," Thomas said. "The forest is not mine. I am a guest here. When a guest leaves, they should leave no mark. That is what my mother taught me." They started walking. Thomas led the way, choosing a route that Clara would never have found on her own. He avoided the steep ridges and thick undergrowth that had made her journey into the valley so difficult. Instead, he followed the contours of the land, moving along natural pathways that the animals used, game trails that wound through the trees in gentle curves. The going was easier than Clara had expected, though her leg throbbed with every step and she had to stop frequently to rest. Each time Clara asked to stop, he simply found a good spot, a flat rock, a fallen log, a patch of dry ground, and waited beside her in comfortable silence. He did not hover or fuss. He did not ask her if she was okay every 5 minutes. He simply watched the forest and gave her time. During one of these rest stops, about an hour into the walk, Clara asked him something that had been on her mind since the night before. "Thomas, you said your people had been losing their language, their knowledge, their traditions. Is there anything being done to preserve them?" Thomas was quiet for a long time. He was sitting on a rock beside the trail, his bow resting across his knees, his eyes moving slowly across the trees. When he spoke, his voice was measured and careful. "Some things are being done," he said. "There are people in the community who are trying to record the language. Linguists come sometimes from the universities. They bring their recorders and their notebooks and they sit with the elders and write down words and phrases. There are programs in the schools now too, where children can learn some of the language." He paused and picked up a small stone from the ground, turning it over in his fingers. "But a language is not just words," he continued. "A language is a way of seeing the world. When my mother spoke in our language, she was not just saying things. She was expressing ideas that do not exist in English. There are words in our language for the way sunlight moves through water. There are words for the sound a deer makes when it senses danger but has not yet decided to run. There are words for the feeling you get when you stand in a very old forest and you know that the trees are aware of you." Clara listened, fascinated. As a scientist, she understood the concept of language shaping perception. There were studies that showed that people who spoke different languages literally saw the world differently, that the words available to them shaped what they noticed and how they categorized their experiences. But hearing Thomas describe it in terms of sunlight and deer and ancient trees made the concept feel vivid and urgent in a way that academic papers never had. English cannot hold those ideas, Thomas said. When you translate them, they lose their meaning. They become flat, like pressing a flower in a book. The shape is still there, but the life is gone. He tossed the stone into the stream. That is what we are losing, not just words. An entire way of understanding the world, a way that took thousands of years to develop, that was refined and tested and passed down through more generations than anyone can count. And once it is gone, it cannot come back. You cannot reinvent a language. You cannot rebuild a worldview from scraps and recordings. It is like trying to grow a forest from a photograph. They walked on. The trail climbed gradually out of the valley, winding through groves of smaller trees and patches of open meadow where wildflowers grew in thick, colorful clusters despite the late season. Clara saw plants she recognized from her research: trillium, wild ginger, columbine, and many others she did not know. Thomas seemed to know them all. As they walked, he would occasionally point to a plant or a tree and name it. Not in English, but in his language, a fluid, musical sound that rose and fell like the terrain they were crossing. Sometimes he would add a brief explanation. This one makes a tea that calms the stomach. This one can be woven into rope stronger than any cord you can buy in a store. This one blooms only once every 7 years. And when it does, the elders say it means the land is ready for something new. Clara found herself pulling out her notebook and scribbling down everything she could. She was a scientist, and her instinct was to record, to document, to preserve. But she also felt something that went beyond professional interest. She felt a profound sense of privilege. Thomas was sharing knowledge that very few people in the world still possessed, knowledge that was alive and practical and deeply connected to the land they were walking through. Every plant he named, every story he told, was a thread in a tapestry that was unraveling, and she was being allowed to see it before it disappeared. Around midday, they stopped beside a wide creek to rest and eat. Thomas caught 2 small trout from the creek with his bare hands, a feat that Clara watched with open-mouthed amazement. He moved with such patience and precision, standing motionless in the shallow water until a fish drifted close, then striking with a speed that blurred his hands. He cleaned the fish on a flat rock and cooked them over a small fire that he built and extinguished within 30 minutes, leaving no trace behind. As they ate, Clara told Thomas about her research. She explained what she was studying: the old-growth forests, the tree ring data, the ecological history of the region. Thomas listened with quiet attention, asking occasional questions that revealed a deep understanding of the subject. "You are trying to learn what the forest was like before humans changed it," he said. "Yes, essentially. My people could have told you." There was no bitterness in his voice, just a simple statement of fact. "We kept records too, not on paper, in stories, in songs. My grandmother knew a song that described the great fire that burned through this valley 300 years ago. The song told you which trees survived, which animals returned first, how long the land took to heal. If you had that song and could understand it, it would tell you more than any tree ring." Clara set down her food. She looked at Thomas across the fire and felt a strange mix of emotions: admiration for the depth of knowledge he represented, grief for what had been lost, and a growing sense of responsibility that she could not quite define. "Is the song still known?" she asked. "My grandmother sang it to me once," Thomas said. "I remember parts of it, but I was young, and I did not understand then what I was hearing. By the time I was old enough to understand, she was gone, and no one else knew the song." He said it without self-pity, without drama. It was simply the truth. A song that had carried 300 years of ecological knowledge had been reduced to fragments in the memory of one man, and when Thomas was gone, those fragments would be gone too. They finished eating and continued walking. The terrain was gradually becoming more familiar to Clara. She recognized landmarks she had passed on her way in: a distinctive rock formation shaped like a clenched fist, a grove of madrone trees with their smooth red bark, a creek crossing where she had stopped to fill her water bottles 2 days earlier. They were getting close. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds for the first time since Clara had entered the valley. Golden light poured through the canopy, and the wet forest glittered and steamed. The warmth felt extraordinary on Clara's face and arms after 2 days of cold and grey. She turned her face up to the sky and closed her eyes, letting the sunlight soak into her skin. When she opened her eyes, Thomas was watching her with an expression she had not seen before. It was soft, almost gentle, and there was something in it that looked like recognition. "What?" she asked. "My mother used to do that," he said. "Stand in the sun with her eyes closed." She said, "The sun speaks to you when you are still enough to listen." Clara smiled. It was the first time she had smiled since the fall, and it felt strange and wonderful, like a muscle she had forgotten she had. They walked for another 2 hours. Clara's leg was burning now, the numbing effect of the herbal paste having worn off long ago. Each step was an exercise in willpower. She leaned heavily on her walking stick and gritted her teeth against the pain. Thomas stayed close, matching her pace, occasionally placing a steadying hand on her elbow when the trail was rough. As the sun began to dip toward the western ridgeline, they emerged from the trees onto the old dirt road where Clara had parked her truck. It was still there, exactly where she had left it, covered in a thin layer of dust and pine needles. Clara nearly wept at the sight of it. She limped to the truck and leaned against the tailgate, breathing hard. Her body was finished, completely and utterly spent. She could feel the wound in her leg pulsing with her heartbeat, hot and insistent. She needed a hospital. She needed antibiotics and stitches and probably a tetanus shot. But she was here. She had made it. Thomas stood a few feet away, his pack slung over one shoulder, his bow in his hand. He looked at the truck and then at the road, and then back at the forest behind them. Clara could see something shifting in his face. A reluctance, a pulling away. He was preparing to leave. "Thomas," she said quickly, "let me drive you somewhere. Your home, a town, anywhere. It is the least I can do." He shook his head. "I have more work in the forest. The elk herd is still moving through the valley. I need to follow them for another few days." "But your camp! You broke it down!" "I will build another one. It takes about an hour." Clara studied him. He was already drifting back toward the trees, his body angling away from the road and toward the wilderness. He belonged there, she realized, not in the way that she belonged there as a visitor and a researcher, but truly belonged. The forest was not something he visited. It was where he lived, in the deepest sense of the word. "Will I see you again?" she asked. Thomas considered this. "If you come back to this forest, you might. I am here most autumns. The elk know me. I follow them, and they let me." Clara reached into her truck and pulled out a business card from the center console. She held it out to him. "This has my email and my phone number. If you ever want to talk about the forest, about your people's knowledge, about anything, I would like to hear more." Thomas took the card and looked at it. Then he tucked it into the pocket of his jacket. Clara did not know if he would ever use it, but she wanted him to have it. "Thank you," she said. "I know I already said that, but I mean it. You saved my life." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something in his language, a phrase of several words that Clara could not understand but that sounded, to her ears, like a blessing. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means, the forest sent you here for a reason," Thomas said. "My mother used to say it. She believed that the land brings people together when they need each other. She believed that nothing in the forest happens by accident." He shifted his pack on his shoulder and took a step toward the trees. Then he paused and looked back. "Take care of that leg," he said. "And when you write your research paper about the old trees in the valley, remember that the trees have stories that go deeper than rings. They have memories that live in songs and languages in the hands of people who have touched them for thousands of years. If you can find a way to include that in your science, you will be telling a truer story than any data can tell alone." Then he turned and walked into the forest. Clara watched him go. He moved between the trees with that same fluid, silent grace that had astonished her from the first moment she saw him. Within 30 seconds, he was invisible, absorbed back into the wilderness as completely as the mountain lion had been the day before. Clara stood by her truck for a long time, looking at the forest. The sun was low now, painting the treetops in shades of gold and amber. The air smelled of pine and rain and distant smoke. Somewhere in the depths of the woods, an owl called, its voice echoing through the ancient trees. She climbed into her truck, started the engine, and drove slowly down the dirt road. Every bump and rut sent a jolt of pain through her leg, but she barely noticed. Her mind was full of everything she had experienced, the beauty of the valley, the terror of the mountain lion, the pain of her wound. and above all, the quiet, profound wisdom of a man who had appeared from the forest like a figure from another time. She reached the hospital in Willits 2 hours later. The emergency room doctor examined her leg and confirmed what Thomas had already told her. The wound was deep and contaminated, but someone had done an excellent job of cleaning it and closing it with stitches. The doctor looked at the plant fiber sutures with undisguised curiosity and asked Clara where she had received field treatment. Clara told him the story, and the doctor shook his head in amazement. Whoever did this knew what he was doing, the doctor said. The wound is clean. No signs of serious infection. The stitches are as good as anything I would have done. Better, maybe. I am going to put you on antibiotics and replace these sutures with modern ones. But honestly, this man probably saved your leg. Clara lay in the hospital bed that night, her leg properly bandaged and the antibiotics dripping into her arm through an IV line. She stared at the ceiling and thought about Thomas Bauer. She thought about his mother and her songs. She thought about his uncle and the old ways of hunting. She thought about a language that was dying, word by word, speaker by speaker, like a fire burning down to its last few coals. And she thought about what he had said at the end. The forest sent you here for a reason. Clara had never been a spiritual person. She dealt in data and evidence and measurable outcomes. She did not believe in fate or destiny or the idea that the land could bring people together. But something had happened in that valley that she could not explain with science. She had been injured and alone and hunted by a predator, and a man had appeared from the trees and saved her life using knowledge that was thousands of years old. That was not just luck. That was not just coincidence. It was something else, something that existed in the space between fact and faith, between what could be measured and what could only be felt. Over the following weeks, as her leg healed and she returned to her work in San Francisco, Clara found that the experience had changed her. She still collected data. She still measured tree rings and analyzed soil samples and wrote research papers filled with charts and statistics, but her papers had a new dimension now. She began including sections on indigenous ecological knowledge, citing the oral histories and traditional practices of the Cahto and other native peoples who had lived in the forests she studied. She reached out to tribal communities and asked if they would be willing to share their knowledge. Some were cautious, some were suspicious of yet another researcher coming to take their stories, but some were willing to talk, and the conversations that resulted were among the most illuminating of Clara's career. She published a paper 8 months later that combined tree ring data with indigenous oral histories to reconstruct the ecological history of the Mendocino County forests over the past 500 years. The paper showed that the oral histories contained information that the tree ring data confirmed but could not have revealed on its own. Details about fire patterns, animal migrations, and climate shifts that had been preserved in songs and stories for generations. The paper was widely praised and helped to legitimize the inclusion of indigenous knowledge in mainstream ecological research. Clara sent a copy of the paper to the general store in Willits, with a note asking the woman behind the counter to pass it along to Thomas Bauer if she ever saw him. Clara did not know if the message would reach him. She did not know if he would read the paper or if he would care, but she wanted him to know that his knowledge, his mother's songs, his uncle's teachings, they were not forgotten. They were alive in the pages of a scientific journal, woven into the data like threads of gold in a tapestry. 3 months after the paper was published, Clara received a letter. It came in a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in neat, careful script. The letter said, "I read your paper. My mother would have been proud. You told the story of the trees the way they would have told it themselves, with rings and with songs. Thank you for listening. The forest remembers those who listen. Thomas." Clara read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the front pocket of her field bag, next to her compass and her notebook. She carried it with her on every trip into the wilderness from that day forward. And every time she stood among the ancient trees, she would close her eyes and turn her face toward the sun. And she would listen, not with her ears, but with something deeper, something that Thomas had helped her find, something that had been there all along, waiting in the silence between the trees. In the space between the data and the truth, the forest speaks to those who are still enough to hear it. And Clara Bennett, the woman who had screamed in the wilderness, who had bitten down on leather while a stranger saved her life, who had walked out of the forest changed in ways she was still discovering, she was listening. She would always be listening.